Welcome. My guests are two persons from the European Parliament, from the ECPM party. Christian Terhes, you're welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Márton Gyöngyösi, you're
Thank you
welcome.
for having me.
What is it important to maintain the European Union structure in time like this?
Well, first of all, we see that the current European Union, it's under a lot of stress and it has a lot of challenges. And usually in moments like this, it's important to look back and see why exactly we got here and from where. After the Second World War, we saw nations that killed each other. So there were wise leaders back then, political leaders. It's very important to point these out because unfortunately, the European Union right now is not led anymore by strong and visionary leaders. They said, let's bring all these people together, find a way not only how to forgive each other after what happened during the Second World War, but how to reconcile each other. And the best way to do that is to work together, to do business together, and implicitly to bring peace through prosperity. So especially nowadays, when we see what is happening around Europe, the situation in Ukraine, I mean, the current situation in Israel right now, maybe now I think the European project, as it was envisioned by the founding fathers of this project, could be a solution for many conflicts in the world. Because when neighbors, even if they, let's say, they don't like each other, it happens, right? We have the example of Germans and French. But they were able, to bypass that, to overcome that. And working together, they were able to bring prosperity, and through that, to bring peace that it's everlasting, right now. So I think this model could be supported all across the globe. That's the reason why, as European Union, we should never ever forget the foundation of this project, bringing peace through prosperity, respecting the fundamental rights, and nevertheless, the main foundation was the Judeo-Christian values.
The same question is for you.
I think it's very important to start from where Christian also started off from. It's very important to understand that the European Union is a peace project. And it has been established, it has been constructed in order to bring peace between warring nations that have been killing each other for centuries. And I think the basic idea of the European Union is to negotiate between member states and to reconcile differences through compromises, through constructed compromises. And I think when someone works in the European Union and is present here in these discussions within the European institutions, understands that the EU is about finding compromise between 27 various opinions. And this is how it started off first with 6 nations. Today it has been expanded to 27 nations and it can expand further. But the basic idea is to have everyone at the negotiating table, have all the opinions meet at the negotiating table of the European institutions with the aim and the objective to find a compromise solution. And I think in the past couple of years, we have seen how the European Union can function sometimes better than the individual member states. When it comes to overcoming crises like the migration crisis, like a virus on the COVID, I think it has become very evident that nation states cannot necessarily individually overcome these crises. It's very good to have a European institution or a European construction whereby we can have a common standpoint on something and have a common position on something and bring about solutions which are solutions important for all 27 member states. It has been very evident, or it should be evident, when it comes to fending off a migration crisis that is threatening our European civilization. It is important when it comes to a virus which doesn't know or doesn't recognize the boundaries of nation states. It is important when it comes to environmental crises or climate problems, which also doesn't recognize nation states and boundaries. I think an overall solution has to be found, and the EU has a very important role to play in that.
What kind of challenge do the current military conflicts pose to the community? Of course, I think it's Ukraine, Russia, and the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Well, first of all, the fact we saw after Russia invaded Ukraine, out of the blue, especially the countries that had a border with Ukraine, were faced with millions of refugees, not migrants, refugees. These people actually left Ukraine because there was no way for them to stay there. They would have risked their lives. So, especially, or at least in Europe, since the Second World War, we haven't seen this kind of or that many people, fleeing a conflict in Europe. I mean, we saw Syrians and we saw other people, fleeing other kind of conflicts, but not in Europe. So that was clearly a challenge. And I think in that regards, the European and the member states were able to overcome that challenge because they were well received. I mean, I know in Romania, when the war started, on the second day I was on the border because I wanted to make sure that everything works properly. And then I'm part of Libe committee and Petty committee here in the parliament. So I was having discussions with Commissioner Johansson. So I wanted to make sure that everything goes smooth. So I wanted to see what was happening with my own eyes. So when you see regular people, it took days for the authorities, to catch up. But right when the war started and people start fleeing, and coming in Romania, and I saw the same thing happen in Hungary, Poland, the first who opened their arms and their houses were the regular folks, regular families, not the government. So I think this proved once again that besides all, besides any, what might separate us, as far as nationality, language, age, whatever, geographical position, we are all humans and we can find help, I would say, when someone is in need. But beyond that, looking and seeing the war in Ukraine, I think we have to realize that at the end of the day, we have to find a way how to contain Russia. If Russia keeps pushing and keeps doing what it does in Ukraine, obviously a lot of countries are asking, well, could we be next? Especially if you're part of the Baltic countries, for example. I mean, very small countries, part of NATO, if they are attacked by Russia, what would be the reaction of NATO? Will NATO react or not? I mean, so ideally is to not be put in that position, And in order to do that, you have to have a strong economy. You have to have a strong military. You have to have a strong political cohesion. So I think what we need to learn from the war in Ukraine and what is happening right now in Israel, that when it comes to army, when it comes to security, the professionals should be allowed to do their jobs. When the politicians are interfering with the military or with the intelligence agencies, we see the collapse and the kind of failures that we saw even in Israel right now. So that would be the most important learning lesson, I would say, that we could draw from this. The politicians should do their part, making sure that the conflicts are avoided. But at the same time, you should allow the professionals to build a strong military, strong security and intelligence community to make sure that your borders are protected and your sovereignty is protected from external threats.
Márton Gyöngyösi?
I think these conflicts that we have seen in the neighborhood of the European continent in the past decade, where the whole neighborhood of the EU was destabilized, North Africa, the Middle East, and now Ukraine, it shows and it has demonstrated how fragile and how exposed the European continent is security-wise and defense-wise. It has shown that in terms of foreign policy, in terms of defense policy, the EU is not the superpower it is economically. And I think it has started off a slow thinking about integrating within the European Union, or at least coordinating defense and security instruments in order to step up collectively in such situations. I'm very glad that after the first migration crisis we had in 2015, now the discussion within this House and within the European institutions is much more realistic and much more sensible than it used to be at the time. At the time it was a disaster. Now we are, I think, not there yet, but at least we are heading the right direction in finding a common coordinated solution. When the North African countries, Middle Eastern countries were destabilized under the Arab Spring, I think it caught the European civilization off guard completely.
Yeah.
Today, when the conflict in Ukraine broke out, in an instant, and I think that's where Vladimir Putin got his calculations completely wrong, the European nations were speaking one voice and uniting in helping Ukraine and fighting off Russian aggression, helping the refugees coming from Ukraine, and helping politically with means of diplomacy and also with weapons the Ukrainians who were fighting the Russian aggressor. I don't think anybody would have thought, even a couple of years ago, that in any issue concerning foreign policy or with any foreign policy dimension, the EU would act as one. I think still we're under a US military umbrella, which NATO is, but the EU has managed to act in a concerted fashion. And I think that's very important in terms of European cooperation and in strengthening the EU. I think the EU will be stronger if it has a foreign policy, a defense policy, a security policy, which harmonizes 27 countries' strategy, and I think it's a good way forward.
It's a very important question. Why are the EU funds important for the member states in nowadays?
Well, first of all, it's important to understand what these EU funds are. They are coming from the states.
Yeah.
So EU is taking this money, from the states, and then is redistributing kind of the money based on the needs and based on other criteria. So imagine now you are from Hungary, I'm from Romania.
Yeah.
We were behind the Iron Curtain. We did not have a free market economy. While the West was flourishing, in our case, we had to, find a way to live from one day to another. I still remember when I was a kid to stay in line to buy bread, to buy milk, to buy food, whatever, So imagine now, after the fall of communism, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Romania, Czechia.
Yeah.
So when these countries joined the European Union, clearly there was a discrepancy between the economical growth in the West and from the East. So how do you cannot equalize them, but you have to find a way how to help these countries catch up. So this was the purpose of many of these European funds. The way they were intended, I would say they were well intended. Now, the way they are used and how the European Commission is using these funds right now to blackmail certain countries, I don't think that it's okay. I understand if a country, breaks the treaty or whatever, you have means as a Commission, as a guardian of the treaty, to use certain means, legal means, to defend the treaty. But what they are doing right now with the so-called rule of law mechanism, where they are, hijacking or coercing countries, to do something that, let's say, sometimes it's against their national interests. I don't think that it's okay, because, as we mentioned, both of us earlier, this project was seen as a project to bring all these countries together, to work together for the common good of all. The purpose of the European project was not to replace the member states, but actually to help the member states. But now we have an unelected bureaucracy run by Ursula von der Leyen, which is using these funds, at their discretion. This is where the debate has to take place, I would say, and to make sure that the money are obviously properly used, but at the same time they are not used as a weapon to blackmail countries, I would say, for political gain, for, you know, a party or a politician that might be sympathetic to this unelected Brussels bureaucracy.
Why important the EU funds?
The EU funds play an extremely important role in the imbalances between member states to balance out. I think the EU funds' main role is to close the gap between the core member states or the old member states and the new ones. They serve the purpose of both in terms of infrastructure, in terms of well-being, in terms of wages, to bring the countries on the same level. I mean, we have spoken about what the EU is. The EU is a peace project, but the EU is also an economic project, first and foremost. I think it has been seen by many, and it is still seen by many, as first and foremost a common market, within which there is free movement of labor, free movement of capital. Now, we both come from countries of the periphery, from the eastern periphery of the European civilization, of the European Union. And we both see that if our countries lag behind the wealthy Western European countries, we suffer enormously, socially and in other ways. I think both in Romania and in Hungary, one of the biggest problems we have is that our citizens are escaping our countries and fleeing to Western Europe because of for wage purposes, to work, to live a proper life, or at least a better life than what they could live in their own motherland. I think that's a terrible thing. I mean, I think everyone has a right to stay and to flourish in their own birthplace, in their own country where they were born. And of course, if they enjoy the freedom of movement, that's a bonus, that's a benefit, that's an extra. But the fact that the EU could not help more rapidly for member states of the periphery to catch up is a failure. I think a lot more should be done to close the gap between periphery member states and core member states. But it's not only the EU's fault and the EU's blame. Also, some of our governments can be blamed for misusing and abusing EU funds, which should serve the purpose of closing the gap. I mean, I can just speak on behalf of my own experience and the Hungarian experience. Too often have we experienced that EU funds were channeled into pockets of politicians, into useless projects, and basically they were feeding systemic corruption in the country. So I think the member states and governments of member states and the EU, they share a common responsibility for the European project. The EU also has part of the blame, but I think also member states and member states' governments also share the blame for this project moving slower than it should be.
We talk about the EU funds, and why is it a problem the EU funds are misplaced through the corruption? The corruption is a very big problem in Romania and a very big problem in Hungary.
Well, realistically speaking, there's corruption everywhere. Usually,
of course.
The kind of corruption we have in eastern part of Europe is the so-called greasing the wheel. In other words, if you have too much bureaucracy and too many bureaucratic processes, you want to kind of jump the, the queue. How do you do that? You give a bribe to someone. Now, in order to fight that kind of corruption, the so-called greasing the wheel, you have to reduce bureaucracy. The other kind of corruption that, we see it in our countries, but you'll see it heavily here in Brussels, is abuse of power. In other words, you have someone in office who's using the money to that person's discretion. And we saw what happened during the pandemic, for example, with the contract signed by Ursula von der Leyen to purchase 4.6 billion doses of vaccines worth 70-some billion euros. It doesn't make any sense. Even as of today, us as elected members of the European Parliament haven't seen the full version of these contracts. Now, how do you fight this kind of corruption? You increase transparency. So for us in Eastern Europe, coming from former communist countries where the power was in the hands of few, in order for us to survive, the only way to survive back then was to bribe someone, because there was no other way, right? So imagine that this habit stays there in the society. You know, it's like a muscle memory, right? So it takes a while to educate people, you know, in order to carve corruption. First of all, you carve corruption by not giving any bribe. And if someone is asking for a bribe, then you go and you file a complaint against the person, and you make sure that that person is not in office anymore. But that's where you deal with this so-called Greece and deal with. But now the problem is with the abuse of power. What do we do with this? This is where you need media. You need to make sure that the journalists, you know, are exposing this acts of corruption. Make sure that people are aware about what is going on. Make sure that you have transparency. You know, I mean, everybody's talking about digitalization nowadays. Even as of today, you go on the Commission's website. Ideally, would be to go, click on a button and see what's the budget, how much money was spent on this, how much on that. You can find that. You have to dig. You have to read a lot of documents. So the more transparency you have and the less bureaucracy you have, the less corruption you have, and more power will be to the people. And then by doing so, usually the politicians will refrain, you know, from taking a bribe or abusing the power.
I think there are two types of corruption, or well, there are many types of corruption, but there are two big categories, and I think in this discussion we have to distinguish between the two. One is corruption as such, and there is systemic corruption. There is corruption by default, and there is corruption as planned, or systemic corruption. And I think in most places, or in normal democracies, I think it's corruption by default. And there, I think it's true what you said, Christian, that corruption is everywhere. I mean, corruption is in the European institutions, corruption is in Romania, corruption is in Hungary, corruption is even in Switzerland, probably, and in Germany. The real issue is, does the state and the government do everything in its capacity to fight that corruption? Does it do everything for transparency, as you mentioned it correctly? Because if it doesn't, if it is part of the problem and it is creating corruption to stay in power, then then we have a problem. Then you cannot fight corruption. And I think in this regard, there is a big difference between Romania and Hungary. In Romania, I think where corruption is probably rampant, just the same way as it is in Hungary.
Now it's not as bad, but
it's historic. It's historically it's embedded in our societies. That's correct. But I think in Romania, in the past decades, you have done a lot to be a lot more transparent than my country, for instance. In your country, I have seen pictures taken of politicians and sometimes ministers, prime ministers, in handcuffs being escorted to the jail. And it is no coincidence that the anti-corruption, the head of the anti-corruption office has become the chief prosecutor in the EPPO in the European Union. I think that's a great recognition for Romania and a great recognition for the anti-corruption steps that Romania has taken. And that shows that in Romania there is a real fight against corruption, and that's great, that's good. In my country, in Hungary, what I see is that there is a systemic corruption. The reason why we don't see corruption being exposed the way you described it, by journalists, by politicians, and by the prosecution, the public prosecution in Hungary, is because corruption is systemic. There is no consequences or negative consequences of corruption in Hungary today. And this is why I say that when the EU criticizes Hungary for not obeying the rules and not keeping by the values of the European Union and not doing everything in its capacity to fight corruption, then they have a point to make. And although the EU doesn't use these instruments at every time properly, and it does look like a blackmail, the EU has a point when it is saying that in certain countries corruption is systemic and it is part of the system. And why do we have to fight against corruption? We have to fight against corruption because these funds that we receive are, as you mentioned, Christian, at the very beginning of this discussion, it is taxpayers' money.
Yeah.
It is EU member states' money. It is EU citizens' money. So if there is corruption, then we basically steal the populations and the taxpayers' money. And this is why it has to be fought through transparency and through various means.
And I would like to add something here. Fighting corruption, especially for us in Eastern Europe, this is it's a common work.
Yeah.
I would say. Citizens also have to pay attention to this, because I remember in Romania back in the days, where you could not do anything, you could not open a business unless you pay a bribe. It took us 15, 20 years, to change that. But the perception of the population was very important, because NGOs, and journalists and even priests, I was a priest in the US, for example, and I was yelling from the US, you should be less corrupt and all that, because it's the only way to change the society. So the question here, if you look from the perspective of the government, are you part of the solution or part of the problem? You cannot be both. You're either or. So for the government, it's very important to be involved, but if the government doesn't do its job, then you use other means, okay? Let's say civical means, NGOs, journalists, whatever, petition, do all that. Because at the end of the day, imagine how much growth the money, for example, in our countries was misused. Could have brought, to have more jobs, to maybe have more people, who were not forced to leave our countries, to find work and a better life, God knows where, in Western Europe. So this fight, I would say, also have to start from us, from each one of us, from our citizens, to understand that our future depends on it.
I think we discussed that topic.
Okay. Considering the past decades, where are the Hungarian-Romanian relationships going now, nowadays?
I think they are, they are going well. I would say I'm from Transylvania, from northwest of Transylvania, from Ziloch in Hungarian. We have many Hungarians over there. Back in the days, years ago, there used to be, tensions and stuff. I don't see that anymore. And here, because a few months ago, I was part of a delegation from the European Parliament in we call it in Romanian, Ținutul Secuiesc, Sekeli, something. I don't know exactly how you call it in Hungarian.
Of course, Székely.
Székely. They have problems with bears because they passed a law a few years ago not to hunt bears anymore. So obviously they grew, and they cannot be maintained anymore. So I was there and I talked to people. So the funny part is when you talk to them, the more you realize, man, these are like people like us. They have same desires as us, same wishes, same wants, same dreams. So the more people will talk to each other, I think many of these conflicts or tensions, could be overcome. On top of that, tourism is helping a lot. For example, in that part of Romania, there are many Hungarian communities, for example, in certain villages where they kept the traditions, the very old traditions, And I saw Hungarians from Hungary coming over there over the weekend, spending the week over there. So it's great. It's a way, to build a relationship, and at the end of the day, we share the same land, I would say, and we don't have to repeat the mistakes that we see right now in Israel, where they fight over the same land. Man, there's enough land for everybody, you know. So, and the fact that we have a Hungarian party in the Romanian parliament, often they are part of the government or they are supporting the government. So I would say it's a good lesson that could be learned by Ukraine or by others, you know, because I mean, I had a discussion with the Ukrainians exactly about this. And I said, look at the model in Romania, for example, on how to deal with minorities, because at the end of the day, you might have different ethnicity, but you are the citizen of a certain country, you know, you behave in a certain way. We don't have to hate each other, you know, we can respect each other. And at the end of the day, if we work together, it will be better for everybody.
We have started off this discussion by describing the EU as a peace project. And in this regard, I think Hungary and Romania, or the relationship between Hungary and Romania, can also be seen within the European Union as a peace project. I mean, we have spent centuries in Europe and in our neighborhood as well fighting over territory, fighting over borders, frontiers, resources, and so on and so forth. And I think this was up until the 19th century. This was what nation states were doing all over Europe, in Romania as well, in Hungary as well. But I think the EU, it has brought about a new mindset. It is a project in which the real question is not where our borders lie, but the real question is whether you as a Romanian or as a Hungarian, wherever you live, you can practice certain rights or not. And I think you also brought up Ukraine, the issue of Ukraine, where also war is fought over territory, war is fought over minority issues. And I think the lesson that we have learned from the European project is that granting rights to ethnicities, ethnic minorities, indigenous minorities, is the way forward to peaceful coexistence within whichever country it is. If you have the right to speak your own language, if you have the right to send your children to a school in which they are teaching in his or her mother tongue, the child's mother tongue, if you are allowed to respect your traditions, respect your own national symbols, then you can, that's the best way of becoming a loyal citizen of the country and getting recognition and being able to practice the rights that every human being should be granted. So I think Hungarian-Romanian coexistence within the EU is a new opportunity for teaching Hungarians and Romanians to live peacefully side by side as nation states, and also within our own countries. We have Romanian ethnic minority in Hungary. There is a great number of Hungarian ethnicity living in Transylvania, in Romania. And I think by granting these rights, and here the EU can act as a mediator and as someone who can put forward the best practices of the EU, which brought peace to, we are talking in Strasbourg, you know, which used to be a territory which was fought over for centuries between Germans and French. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the European Parliament is in Strasbourg. It's not a coincidence. This is the Transylvania of the West, probably, no? Or it is a very special place. And it is not a coincidence that we have to come here once every month and move painful, everything. It's painful, but we have to bring the sacrifice because this is symbolic. And I think this is something that both Romanians and Hungarians can learn from. And the EU can facilitate this project.
Gentlemen, time is over. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Christian Terhes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.